Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Colorful Profiles, our 6-week journey exploring short stories of extraordinary and unexpected characters from Jewish history, Lesson 3. Today we are doing Lesson 3, which is titled Unsung Heroines. We are going to talk about, I have 3 on the schedule. I have a feeling we're only going to make it to 2 famous Jewish heroines. The 3 that we have on tap, if you will, are Donya Grazia, Rebbetzin Bela Katz, and Glickel of Hamon. I have a feeling that for time we are going to leave Glickel of Hamon, who they actually very prudently put in an appendix, which was nice of them. Sometimes they stuff it all into the lesson, and I'm moving my way along very quickly, etc. They nicely put it in an appendix, and they said, if you have time, do it. If you don't. So I'll leave that, I think, for today. For those that would like to explore it on their own, they can do so on their own. So today, Lesson 3, we're mainly going to be talking about 2 of them. If we have some extra time at the end, maybe we'll talk a little bit about Glickel of Hamon. Today's lesson is generously co-sponsored by Danny Levin, who's here with us. Thank you, Danny. And Gail Levine will be with us this evening. As Danny says, I must have reached the L's in the sponsorship list. So thank you very much to both of you for sponsoring for today. And without further ado, let us dive into it. As usual, before we talk about a specific category of heroes, of stories, of profiles, I'd like to talk a little bit about the topic. And that is, in this case, we are talking about Jewish women. So I'd like to take maybe 15 minutes before we start today's lesson, or perhaps as the beginning of today's lesson, if you will, to talk about what it means to be a great Jewish woman. What are the unique defining characteristics? And I want to, again, separate it, just like last week. In other words, last week we spoke about great Jews, and then we clarified that the people we want to talk about are the people that were great because of their Judaism, right? And perhaps a little bit more than just, they were very smart because they were Jewish, or they were very curious because they were Jewish, or because they questioned everything because they were Jewish, etc. Somewhere where they had an influence on the world specifically through their Judaism. So today we want to talk about people that are uniquely women, obviously, but more importantly, they were great and great women, obviously, people that are worthy of us learning from them and that have amazing stories, which obviously is everyone, but some to a greater effect than others, and that's today's lesson. And specifically, we want to talk about great women who were great because they were Jewish. In other words, there was something about their Jewish identity that shone forth, and specifically that they were Jewish women. Their Judaism affected them as women in the way that in the way that they interacted with the world and the amazing things that they accomplished during their lives. So our starting point for trying to understand what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a great Jewish woman is, of course, in the book of Mishlei. The book of Mishlei is, of course, Proverbs, written by Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, the wisest of all men. And the final chapter of the book concludes with a song of praise for the ideal woman of valor. Many of you might be familiar with this song because we sing it in our homes on Friday night after Shalom Aleichem. Some people sing it to their wives, some people sing it to the whole table. There's different discussions about why we do it on a Friday night. The most obvious is, of course, that it's a time to appreciate family, etc. So we appreciate our wives and our daughters. But another reason is that Shabbat itself is considered a woman. And that's perhaps a topic that's beyond the discussion of today's lesson. But in terms of time, Shabbat is considered feminine and the 6 days of the week are considered masculine in terms of the roles that they play in time. But again, a discussion for a different time. So what I'd like to do for you is as follows. There is a song, a melody, which I think is roughly 100 and something years old, which sings the tune of Eshes Chayil. And this is a tune that was made up by a cantor. His name was Ben Zion Schenker. And we're going to watch it here on a video. And the idea is to go through it, how should I say? We'll hear it sung, we'll see the Hebrew words and the English words, and you'll see that there are essentially 31 verses describing various different themes, various different character traits, the qualities that are emphasized to be what makes a Jewish woman unique, or what the ideal Jewish woman should strive for. So I have for you 2 things. First of all, we have this beautiful video that we're going to watch, and you can go through. We're not going to read text 1. We're just going to follow along as it appears on the screen. And then while we're doing so, I want you to try and identify themes, recurring themes that you see throughout the hymn, Specifically, let's try to come up with 5 of them, and that's exercise 3.1 on page 100. Let's try to come up with 5 different qualities that are emphasized in this ode to the woman of valor. Please turn your attention to the video screens.
שסחיר מירצו ורחוי מפנינים מחרו בוטח בולי ופלו אי ושול לא יחסו מולסו אתוי ולא ירו כל ימך יאו Norishotzen fichtim, mit was begreifes kapeyo. Ois koni ois oich, mi merko ki tu vir lachmo, atu kami oir lairu, atit intel belpeveiso, ik oik den arroiseo, zone mo zone vitigo heyu, mi prika peyon otakorem, chagi robi ois masneyu, hameis roseho. Amokito sachro, Bechachnu, Bisoras Chesed, Ali Shoyed Nosoifiyo, Ali Chois Beisu, Lechem Atzilus, Loi Soifei. Omo Vaneya V'yashrua, Palo, V'halelo, Raboi Chonois, Osu Choyim, V'yatolim, Sale curono.
All right, so we are now on page 100, and we're going to try to do exercise 3.1. If you'd like, you can type it in the chat. If you'd like, you can unmute. What do you guys think? What are the main qualities that you see in this ode to the woman of valor that are most represented here? Recurring themes, if you will. Danny, productive, yes. Not just productive in a non-lazy way. Do you see that, Danny? Like I guess that's what you mean by resourceful. I think that's very, very true. Yes, hardworking, not lazy. Mark, go for it.
Trustworthy.
Trustworthy.
I have
yes.
others. I have all of them.
Come again?
Acts with goodness.
Okay, so she's
She
kind.
buys land with her earnings. She speaks wisdom. She helps the poor.
Okay, fantastic. And I see Danny is saying respected, charitable, which I think was similar to what Mark said, supportive and caring. Yes. I think probably which right away, Danny typed in, immediately he typed it in. The first thing I think that comes through from Eshet Chayil are industriousness, resourcefulness. These two traits are expressed, I want to say, at least 10 times in 31 verses. The poem of the hymn of Eshet Chayil, the woman of valor, goes through the alphabet. So it starts with Eshet Chayil and then goes all the way to the end, right? Aleph through Taf. And at least 10 or 15 times it mentions different variations on the theme of she's industrious, she goes out, she's resourceful, etc., etc. And I find this fascinating for a few reasons. We're going to talk about this obviously through the lens of people in history, but I also find it fascinating just in terms of the modern conversation about women. In the secular world, there is a conversation about how for generations and generations women were suppressed by their husbands or suppressed by the patriarchy and men, etc., and women were second-class citizens, etc. And they're kind of portrayed as like these lame duck, lame partners in the relationship, where the men were always front and center. They were the ones getting it done. They were the ones doing everything, and the women were kind of off to the side, not doing much. And I don't really want to comment on so much on whether historically that might have also happened in Judaism, and I think it did, because I think people are people. But what I do want to comment on is you see this poem from this Eshet Chayil poem, which is as ancient. I mean, it literally goes all the way back to. It literally goes all the way back to King Solomon, and whether people were doing this or not is a different conversation we're going to have, and we're going to talk about certain women who were doing this in a major way. But King Solomon is not describing a woman who looks like that. He's describing a woman who's industrious, a woman who takes her life in her own hands, who is resourceful, not lazy, etc. Anyways, so that is for sure, I guess, the first one or two qualities that I would say are being ascribed to the Jewish woman. After that, there are a couple of other. They appear less often than in industriousness and resourcefulness. Devotion was mentioned by a few of you. In terms of their devotion to their homes, their devotion to their children, their devotion to their husbands, and also their devotion to God. Generosity is mentioned. Again, both of you mentioned that. The fact that they are kind, the fact that they do things for other people, that is a big theme. And finally, only mentioned once in the hymn, but really at the end in the most climactic way, if you will, fear of God is mentioned. In other words, we are enjoined sheker achein v'hevel hayofi, not to look at the charm or charisma or beauty of a woman, but rather to look at her inner core, where you see her character. And then the main thing that is mentioned is Isha yirat Hashem hitit halal. Those are the last words of Eshet Chayil, which means a woman who fears God is the one to be praised. Now, the problem with the conversation we're having now is that it's kind of a little all over the place. What do I mean by that? We're kind of looking through a long hymn, which definitely it's a treasure to be able to have that from so long ago, and that's so canonical, if you will, to the Jewish view of a woman. But it almost looks like we're looking at a whole bunch of symptoms, right? Similar to a doctor that looks at a whole bunch of symptoms, and what they're really looking for is the diagnosis of what the patient has that's causing all those symptoms. So what I'd like to talk about now is what is the identity of a woman, of a Jewish woman, of a woman from a Jewish perspective, that really all of these are symptoms of that. And I'll explain what I mean. Already last week we spoke about, and on Lag BaOmer, for those of you that were there at the Lag BaOmer adult party that we had on Thursday night, which was beautiful, the paint and sip, etc. We spoke a lot about spiritual diversity. We did this last week, Monday, as well, when we were talking about the role of 2 weeks ago, when we spoke about the role of a non-Jew in Judaism. We spoke a lot about spiritual diversity. In other words, the idea that, I'll explain what I mean. One way of coming at this is as follows. Who even says that we should even be having a conversation about what a role of a Jewish woman is, or about what the role of a woman is in Judaism? What's the role of a man in Judaism? What's the role of a child in Judaism? What's the role of an older person in Judaism? You know what I mean? Like, they're all Jews. Like, who decides we should be having a conversation with each one independently? And the answer is Judaism decides that. You see that all over Judaism as a theme is that the diversity that God created in this world, whether it be people that are older, that are younger, that are men, that are women, that live, that are American, that are Israeli, that are more creative or that are more academic. All these different parts of a person's identity are not meant to be ignored. We're not supposed to become one homogenous people. We're like, every Jew is a Jew. There is an element to that. There is a core of every Jew, at which point there's what we would call the Pinta Yid, or the core of a Jew, where every Jew is a Jew, is a Jew, is a Jew. But that's not where we're supposed to stop. We're supposed to look beyond that and to embrace our individual identities and serve God through those identities. And so for a woman, and like, honestly, similarly for a man who can do this as a man, but today's lesson is about women, for a woman, it behooves us to understand what specifically about the Jewish character does the Torah want us to focus on? Does the Torah want a woman to focus on and to recognize that these are things that she should be serving God with? And the answer in 2 words, at least according to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, is Akeret Habayit. This is not the Rebbe's novel idea, but the Rebbe often pointed this out, that the woman is the mainstay of the home, or the foundation of the home, or the center, what's the word? The nerve center of the home. And let's see how the Rebbe describes this in text 2. Mark, if I can ask you to read for us, please.
Text 2.
Text 2. We are on page 101.
Our forefathers, Jacob, arrived in a foreign land where he endured tough times and trials. Nevertheless, he was not deterred by any difficulties. To the contrary, Jacob successfully established the Jewish people in that foreign environment, with all of his children remaining faithful to the tradition of the forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This was only possible thanks to the Jewish mothers, Rachel, Leah, Bilhah, and Zilpah.
Zilpah, that was her name. Yep.
Who did everything on their part to ensure the integrity of their home and the future of their people. This is the deeper significance of the concept that the Jewish woman is the mainstay of the home, not only of her individual household, but also of the entire house of Israel.
Okay. So the Rebbe is examining the story of our patriarch Jacob, right? Jacob comes to Lavan. Famously, he's running away from his brother Esav. Yaakov is running away from Esav. And he comes to his uncle Lavan, who is a trickster. And eventually, after the whole story, he marries 4 women. Okay, without getting into all details, he wants to marry Rachel. Instead, he marries Leah. He ends up marrying this one. Okay, he ends up marrying 4 women. The Torah makes a very, very strong point about, or a strong emphasis on the fact that Jacob did not have a lot of time. Okay, Geruftani Yoim, Geruftani Laila. He describes you stole from me by day and you tricked me by night. He's busy, barely trying to be able to in the words of one comical Jewish song, while Jacob paid a fortune for the groceries and the rent. He's busy. He's very, very busy, and yet he has these 12 sons and multiple daughters that he has to support and they have to be brought up, etc. So who does this? Says the Rebbe, it was clearly the home, the Jewish home that we are familiar with. The identity of Jews as Jews, which starts, of course, from Jacob and his children, and then gets passed down generation to generation, comes from not Jacob, but from his 4 wives. Why? Why is it specifically the woman? So we could say, oh, because that's just the way it is. It turns out it's not so simple. Elise, if you can read for us, please, text 3 about feminine influence. The Rebbe wants to try and unpack for us what exactly is the natural difference. If anybody tells you that if you've been to a college course recently where they tell you that men and women are just different on the outside, they have different reproductive organs, but other than that, on the inside they're all the same. It is clearly anybody who knows a couple of women and knows a couple of men knows that that's not the case. So the Rebbe wants to try and understand what is it about the character of a woman that makes her uniquely suited for this job. Elise, when you're ready, text 3. Don't forget to unmute yourself. Feminine influence, page 102.
Okay. Is it true or not? Okay. Jewish women have a unique calling to guide others to love and cherish Judaism. This calling begins at home with their own families. Every Jewish woman has the responsibility and obligation to devote herself to the spiritual well-being of her family, using her unique feminine qualities of kindness and compassion. She has the ability to provide the appropriate nature nurture
Mm-hmm.
to each member of her family, guiding them and drawing them closer to Torah. The Baal Shem Tov taught that all Jews are like brothers and sisters, belonging to a single family. It therefore follows that this guidance should extend beyond one's nuclear family until it reaches the entire Jewish people.
Thank you. Says the Rebbe, the key characteristic that Jewish women have over men is nurturing, or let's put it, the nurturing characteristics of kindness, compassion, and devoted care. And now I'm not arguing that this is across the board. I'm not arguing that this is every single woman has all of the nurturing qualities that are perfect. Everybody has a spectrum within which they can work on themselves. I'm not arguing that men are not nurturing. All I'm saying is that if you take a look as a general, if you try to draw a broad stroke, you will notice that women on a natural level, no matter how modern the household is. Take my household, for example, right? I know that in many households, the woman is the one who cooks, and the man is much more the one who earns the finances, right? And brings that in, etc. And for those of you that know my home, you know that usually Shabbat dinner in my home is cooked almost entirely by me. I mean, Kitty is definitely a great cook, but right. And finances, Kitty does plenty well, working very hard every day. She's very industrious, let's put it. But no matter how much you want to play with the roles, right, and that can change no matter what, the nurturing aspect, the fact that a woman will have more patience, will have more compassion, more kindness, and by the way, and more flexibility, which is often, for some reason, portrayed as like a weakness that women have, that maybe they're not strong, independent enough, or things like that, because the modern image of a woman is a strong, independent woman, right? But actually, to be flexible is perhaps more difficult than to be strong and independent, as many men know from struggling with this. How did this turn into a marriage class? I don't know. But either way, the idea that a woman has this nurturing element is really what drives all of the other characteristics that we're talking about in Eishes Chayil. And now, in today's lesson, we are going to learn about the fascinating life stories of at least two, and seeing how the class is going, it will probably be only two, remarkable Jewish women who exemplified the characteristics of the ideal Jewish woman of valor, namely nurturing, and not just nurturing in their own lives, but nurturing family, nurturing community, and nurturing faith. And doing so in an industrious and resourceful manner. Okay, are we ready? Let's dive into it. So the first woman we are going to talk about today is known as Doña Grazia. Now, Doña Grazia, before we even start to talk about her, we need to explain that she's going to be known by a number of names. Okay? And maybe I shouldn't start with that, actually. You know what? Let's not start with that. Let's start by painting a background picture. In Hebrew, this is known as the Reka, the background, for the historical era in which Doña Grazia lives. And instead of me doing so, there's a wonderful scholar that we're going to bring up, a professor at I forget which university, that's going to explain to us exactly what was going on. We are now in Spain and Portugal, the Jews of Spain and Portugal, just around the turn of the Spanish Inquisition. But in order to understand that, we need to go a little bit further back to the 1300s, and then to understand how we arrived at 1492, and what role the Jewish women as a whole played in that era. And then we'll zone in on Doña Grazia. So please turn your attention to the video screens. Let me just share it properly for a video, and there we go.
As is well known, in 1492, the Jews of Spain were expelled by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. This was the culmination of a long process of discrimination against the Jews. So in 1492, thousands of Jews packed up to leave. It was a very difficult decision. They had lived in Spain for hundreds of years. There had been periods of tremendous prosperity and success, the golden age of Spanish Jewry. And this was a terrible failure. A failure of the royal alliance, of their long-standing connections to the kings, to the royalty, Through service, they worked for the kings, they paid taxes, they were economic assets. They also bribed the kings, but this failed. And in 1492, thousands of Jews left. So where were the Jews meant to go? It was a question. What seemed safest was to go to Portugal. Portugal is the country right next door on the Iberian Peninsula. It had a similar culture, a similar climate. There were lots of family connections between Spanish Jews and Portuguese Jews. There were lots of business partnerships between Spanish Jews and Portuguese Jews. And so it made the most sense. In fact, the king of Portugal at the time of the Spanish expulsion was inviting the Jews to come to Portugal. He insisted that he was going to honor Jewish activities, Jewish assets, and many of the Jews left, traveled over the mountains into Portugal, and reestablished their lives there. Little did they know that that welcoming tolerance would be very short-lived. In 1497, a new king in Portugal was now in the process of making a peace treaty with Ferdinand and Isabella. King Manuel was trying to marry the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, and therefore he was told by them that Jews of Portugal have to be expelled as well. And so he announced an expulsion of the Jews for Portugal. But he really had little intention to let the Jews go. Imagine how hard it was for those Jews who had risked everything, left their lives, come to Portugal, just barely reestablished themselves. They're actually very motivated to leave Portugal. They come down on the appointed day. The king has promised that there will be ships on the docks to take them out of Portugal, only to discover that this is really a trick, and the king had little intention to let them go. And on the docks, it gets chaotic, and the Jews are forcibly baptized into Christianity. So it's ironic that the Jews who had the most strength to leave Spain and not take the easier route of converting end up being forcibly converted in Portugal. Once the king of Portugal tells the new Christians, which means those Jews who were forcibly converted, that he's not bringing an Inquisition, it's pretty clear to everyone that they are going to continue practicing Judaism. It's only once the Inquisition does arrive that you really have to go underground with your Jewish practices. So what would it look like to be a Marrano Jew, a secret Jew? All public activities associated with Judaism would have to be cut out. No going to shul, no public activities and charitable organizations. And so essentially, Judaism goes inside the house. Things that can be done within the home and covered over or obscured in their Jewish origins. So some of the main practices that Marranos would do would be lighting Shabbos candles, setting out clean linen for preparation for Shabbos, cooking Jewish foods before a Yontif, baking matzos in secret. These are just some of the things that Marrano Jews tried to keep in secret. These type of activities were very much the roles of women, and women play a huge role in perpetuating Marrano Judaism. When you think about it, all of the public roles of Judaism that are normally performed by men, going to shul, reading the Torah, running charitable organizations, are no longer available to Marrano Jews. And so within the homes, women had a very strong role. Marrano women are considered by the historians the defenders of the faith. They really are the ones who carry forward.
Okay, to understand a little bit more about this era that Doña Grazia is going to be born into, I think we're going to turn to a man whose name is Shmuel Usk. So Shmuel Usk is a man, his name indicates that his family originated in Huesca, Spain. And after the expulsion of 1492, his family sought refuge in Portugal, and then eventually he publishes a book in Ferrara, Italy, okay, in 1553. He calls the book The Consolation for the Tribulations of Israel. You could see that's where text 4 and quite a few texts over the next little while are going to come from. And as its title indicates, the book is attempting to frame the expulsion of Spanish and whatever the suffering and tribulations of Spanish and Portuguese Jewry as God is suffering with them and also miraculously assisting them, and it's also predicting that because of all this, Mashiach is going to be around the corner. Okay, as a result of all this, because this book was very, very encouraging for Jews, it actually was public enemy number one of the church at the time. Its first edition was almost completely destroyed by the church. A second edition was published in Amsterdam in 1559. Very few copies remain from that edition as well. And the Spanish Portuguese Inquisitions were very, very worried about what kind of effect this book could have on bolstering the faith of these conversos that are keeping Judaism alive in secret, and how it could really keep the flame of Judaism alive. So it was included on their list of banned books until the last edition of the list, 1790. Anyways, so Shmuel was born in the late 15th century or early 16th century. So his account of this whole fleeing Spain, going to Portugal, and then the Portuguese Inquisition, and the Portuguese Inquisition coming to power, as we'll soon see, because Portugal was always a few steps behind Spain. It's really childhood memories. And then you'll see that he moves into more adult memories. The linguistic style of the book is written in the first person, as if Yaakov Avinu, Jacob our forefather, is writing the book. So when he says me, he's talking about Jacob, and my children is talking about the children of Jacob, namely the people of Israel, or the Jewish people. So Mark, if you could get us started with text 4, Portuguese promises, in which he's describing what the professor from Torah University was just describing for us. Mark, you're muted. So if you can just read for us, please, text 4, Portuguese promises, on page 105.
Of those who were ejected from the Spanish kingdom and who remained faithful to Judaism, the majority went on to Portugal, King John II, promised to allow them to live in their religion and to provide ships for those who wish to leave.
Okay. Elise, if you can continue for us, please, text 5. What happens, as we just heard, when actually it's not King John, but rather King Manuel, who has to make good on this promise? What happens?
Hey, once King Manuel obtained the crown, he did not wait long to torment me. He soon proclaimed that all Jews in his kingdom must become Christians or leave Portugal within a stipulated period. This proclamation greatly saddened all my children, for their hearts told them that my enemy wished to perpetuate an evil greater than exile, and they determined to leave. Since they had lost their lands, they gathered the rest of their belongings as best they could in this short time and prepared to leave. But when the king realized the Jews' resolve and how little they seemed to mind exile in preference to changing their religion, he revealed his evil intent. He commanded all the Jews in the kingdom to assemble in Lisbon, spreading reports that he would there provide them with ships, but as soon as he had gathered them, he had them herded into a large building called Los Estaos, and when he had corralled them like sheep prepared for the slaughter, he at last exposed his venomous character and announced that all were to become Christians, and that they should go out of love, and they would otherwise have to do so by compulsion. These threats were not sufficient to make my children turn their backs to their God. Instead, they answered resolutely that they would not comply with his requests. Finally,
there's an ellipse. There's a little a couple dots here, proving that there's a little. There's a whole description at this point in the book where Shmuel Usk relates how they tore the Jewish children away from their parents, and they tried to convince them to convert to Christianity. And when they realized that wouldn't succeed, what they did was they kept the children away from the parents. They went to the parents and they told the parents that your children have already converted. You may as well convert to join them. And they took all the children and they had already put them already with Christian families, and the parents did not budge. There's some pretty serious mesiras nefesh, some pretty serious self-sacrifice and standing for your values that happens on the whole Spanish front, as we already learned a little bit last week when we spoke about what was his name? About his name is slipping my mind now. Okay, go ahead. Keep going, Elise. Finally.
Okay. Finally, the king commanded that food and drink be withheld from them for 3 days to try them with anguish, the anguish of hunger. But this they likewise courageously endured. The king realized that even this was insufficient to change them, and that if he starved them any longer, they would perish. Dragging some by their legs and others by their hair and beards, punching and mauling them, his men brought them to the churches where the waters of baptism were thrown upon them. As a result of this violence, contrary to divine and human laws, the bodies of many Jews were made Christian, but no stain ever touched their souls. Instead, they kept forever impressed upon them the seal of their ancient law.
I want to talk about that last line because I think it's a very, very important piece to understand. The Spanish Inquisition, the Spanish expulsion happens in 1492. Many Jews flee to Portugal, but we know that not all of them flee. So there's a whole bunch of them that remain behind in Spain. Some of them, unfortunately, did convert, and some of them converted only outwardly, but were conversos. But by definition, those that fled were the more committed ones. They were the ones that said, no, I want to continue to be Jewish. I'm committed to my Judaism, and I want to continue to be Jewish outwardly, and therefore I'm going to flee to Spain. I'm going to flee Spain and go to Portugal. Now, so when King Manuel rounds them up and forcibly baptizes them, I don't know if he realizes that thought, but as a group, we can make an assumption that the people that he baptizes in Portugal, almost all of them are keeping Judaism in secret. Why? Because this is the more committed group. And now they're being forced to convert, but they're certainly still keeping Judaism alive, no matter how much they can. And that's why Shmuel Ask finishes off. I mean, he's living at that time, so he has a contemporary report, but I'm just trying to give you the more bird's eye view, if you will. This is why he makes this report to us. He says, their bodies of many Jews were made Christian, but no stain ever touched their souls. Okay. It is onto this background that we are going to meet Beatrice de Luna, who will be known as Mendez. She will also be known as Gracia eventually. She will also be known as Hana Nasi eventually, with the last name Nasi. And she's also occasionally known as Benveniste. Why so many names? If you take a look at page 108, you have the family tree of the Mendez Benveniste family. First of all, you will notice that people are intermarrying, never against Jewish law. In other words, never brothers and sisters. But according to Jewish law, you can marry your first cousin, and that seems to happen more often in this era of history. And probably the reason for that is because those are the people that they can be sure are keeping Judaism alive, are keeping Judaism well. You know, you can't really marry random people that you don't know that are telling you that they're Jewish, but outwardly they're Christian. Instead, it's very difficult to know who you're marrying. So that's probably one of the main reasons for this. There's a lot of complex elements to this family tree that I'm not really going to get into, that aren't really relevant to our conversation. But I get hopefully that comment that I just made helps to shed some light on it. What I do want to say is like this: the reason you find so many names to everybody is also because, remember, they have their Christian names, but they also have their Spanish names. Then they have their Jewish names, which sometimes are the same and sometimes different than the Jewish names that they used to have. In other words, if you have a family that over 150 years starts in Spain, makes its way to Portugal, makes its way to Amsterdam, then makes its way, let's say, to Italy, and then to Israel, as we're soon going to see that was Doña Gracia's family's path, they would have had a Jewish name. Then with the expulsion, gotten rid of, maybe kept that Jewish name, maybe had a Spanish name. Maybe they originally had a Spanish name, just like many people today, have I don't know, Mark, I assume your Jewish name is not Mark, right? You have a Jewish name, whatever it is, Moshe, whatever it is, and then Mark is your English name. So they might have had that originally, a Hebrew name and a Spanish name, then adopted a Christian name, and then adopted a new Jewish name later, which may or may not have been the same. And the same goes for family names. I think that's a lot of the reason why we see all these different names. But for the most part, we're going to call Doña Gracia by that name. But there will be other characters that you'll see we'll kind of go in between. I'll try and tell you when there's a name change, etc. On page 109, we have the locations, the map of as they're going to be traveling around. Now, our protagonist, who was born in 1510, and given the Spanish non-Jewish name of Beatriz de Luna, so that's that name. She was descended from a prestigious and very, very wealthy family from Spain that was known as the Benvenista family. So she might not have been a Benvenista, but she came from that family. So she's known as Beatriz de Luna. She's in the Benvenista family, and now when she's about 18 years old, which presumably at the time was pretty old, so in 1528, she marries a wealthy relative, I think a first cousin, if I remember correctly, whose name is Francisco Mendez. Okay, so she becomes Beatriz de Luna now Mendez. She was Benvenista, now she is Mendez. Okay. Francisco Mendez had a brother. That's the next thing I need to introduce you to. Francisco Mendez had a brother. His name was Diogo. And Diogo and Francisco were very, very wealthy business partners. Okay? Now, Francisco lived, as we said, in Spain. And soon you're going to see that they're going to flee to Portugal, etc. Francisco lived in Spain. Diogo lived in Flanders, which is essentially Antwerp, Belgium today. I think it's even known as Flanders in some circles. And together, they operated a business that over the entire region, it was a spice business. They essentially controlled the spice and pepper, specifically trade of all imports into Portugal and into Spain and what today is known as Belgium, in other words, the entire Iberian Peninsula. As a result of this, they have a very, very close relationship with the royal family of Portugal and with other European monarchies. Now, back to our friend Shmuel Usk, he describes the experience of Jews like the Mendez family, who were known as the new Christians, so to speak, and how they were enjoying success in Portugal while observing Judaism quietly. Mark, I think we're back to you. If you can read for us, please, on page 109, text 6, Dual Lives.
The new Christians had become immersed in power and its deceits. They had nearly forgotten their ancient faith and lost the fear of that fountain whence our life flows because of the vast riches and the status and rank that they were acquiring in the kingdom. They now felt secure in their imitation of the Christians, though they never exchanged the secret of their souls.
So this is an interesting description of what a Jew would look like living in Portugal after the Spanish Inquisition already, right? This is early 1500s, and not just a Jew, but swaths of Jews. These are Jews who came from committed Jewish families. That's why they were the ones who fled from Spain to Portugal. But now they're living in Portugal and they have no other choice. They're not being allowed to leave the country. So they're living outwardly as Christians, but inwardly they are Jews, and they're keeping whatever they can inwardly in their homes, etc. And eventually, I hate to say it, but like everything else in life, you get used to it, right? You develop a routine. This is how we operate on the outside. This is how we operate on the inside. I can imagine Jewish children being brought up to know, yes, in our home, every night before you go to sleep, you say Shema, but you never catch anybody else. Don't let anyone else catch you saying Shema, right? The same thing for Shabbat candles, and the same thing for baking matzah, and the same thing for a Seder, and the same thing. And there's lots of stories about these converso Jews, specifically in Portugal. I mean, in Spain as well, but specifically in Portugal in this second era where these new Christians, as they were known, or call them Marranos, or call them conversos, whichever word you want to use, each one has its benefits and its advantages and disadvantages to using them. But this is the way things go. Now, in light of the text that we read at the beginning of this lesson about the role the Jewish women have historically played as the mainstays of Jewish faith, it should come as no surprise that who are the main keepers of the faith, as the professor mentioned in the video, of Judaism? Who are the ones keeping it alive in Portugal? So we have many commentary. We're talking about Jewish sages from that time, or just after that time, that point to the fact that it was the Jewish women that were keeping the spark alive. We will ask a wonderful Jewish woman, Elise Iser, to please read for us text 7, Keepers of the Faith, from he's known as the Maritats, or Rabbi Yom Tov Tzahalo. Go for it.
The Jewish faith is embedded in the hearts of the righteous women of Portugal. They instruct the man and draw them close to the Jewish faith, as we have heard and witnessed.
This is not the only place where Maritats gives a lot of credit to the Jewish women of the time for keeping Judaism alive. There are other places in his shut, or in his responsa, that he does so. I should also note that in the Inquisition's files, they also you also see the dedication of the women in particular to the preservation of Judaism in both Spain and in Portugal. Most of the people convicted by the Inquisition of Judaizing, which was what they called the crime of practicing Judaism despite officially being a Christian, most of the people that were convicted were women. And there's a lot more to be said about this, and maybe we could talk about it at a different time. Anyways, now, in the first decades of the 16th century, it's important to understand that there was no Portuguese Inquisition. Now, this was not by chance. To a large degree, this was credited to Francisco and Diogo Mendes, because these two brothers bribed it just goes to show you that everything works with money. They are bribing King Manuel, who clearly wants the Jews to convert, but they're bribing him to keep the Inquisition out of Portugal. They're also bribing at the same time, because at a certain point, King Manuel actually is the main driving force who wants to establish an Inquisition. For those of you that are not familiar with the term Inquisition, an Inquisition means a tribunal that is specifically going to persecute potential Judaizing new Christians and hold them responsible for it. So they eventually end up bribing the Pope, because believe it or not, in order to have an Inquisition, it had to be signed off by the Pope. Anyways, in any event, you see all of this playing out in many, many different documents from the Inquisition, documents from Jewish sources, documents from just historical sources from non-Jews at the time that are observing what's going on, etc., etc. Anyways, so Francisco, who, as you can imagine, had a huge Rolodex of high-powered friends in high places, if you will, and just to name a few, he was also friends with Charles V, who was the King of Spain and Lord of the Netherlands. And what happens is that at a certain point, Diogo gets imprisoned or gets accused of Judaizing. Guess why? Because he was, right? And this whole Rolodex comes out, and we have all these letters today. Letters to King Henry VIII of England, letters to Queen Catherine, who was Charles V's sister, all these royalty, if you will, all over Europe, that Francisco is writing letters to petition on behalf of Diogo to have Diogo released. And eventually he is released. And on page 110, you can see one of those letters. This one is a letter to King, I think that's pronounced Joao, if I remember correctly. Anyways. Where he's petitioning for the release of Diogo Mendes Benveniste. Okay, now all this is to say that back in Portugal, when Beatrice, so Beatrice and Francisco, very important to understand, they have a daughter who they name Anna. That's in 1535. But shortly thereafter, Francisco dies. Okay, now all this is to say that immediately after Francisco died, and all of the connections that they had and the pressure they were putting to keep the Inquisition out of Portugal dissipates, and the Inquisition does indeed arrive in the 1530s. The religious persecution of conversos really picks up heat, and an Inquisition is eventually established in Portugal. Now, our protagonist, which is a Beatrice, who is now a widow, remember, was of course affected by these general developments, but in her case, there were additional personal circumstances. What's going on? It's important to understand that in those times, based on local conventions, the way that inheritance laws worked was that the fortune of Francisco Mendes was left 50-50. He has this one daughter, Anna. 50% of it was left to her, and the other 50% is left to his wife, her mother, Doña Gracia, or Beatriz de Luna Mendes. She not only controls the 50% of this tremendous fortune that Francisco leaves to her, but she also really controls the 50% that's her daughter's, who's only 1 year old or less when her father dies. So, as you can imagine, she is now in the center spotlight that everybody wants to figure out how can we get into her good graces, etc., including the local kings. Okay, so King Joao wanted to put his hands on the Mendes fortune. So he had a plan. What was his plan? Baby Anna should be raised in the royal palace and then married off to a member to one of the royals. and this would bring half of the Mendez estate under his control. And he starts to exert pressure on Beatrice to concede to the plan. So in addition to everything else that's going on, that it's difficult to live as a Jew, even in secret, and the Inquisition is coming down to is being established in Portugal, on a personal level, Beatrice or Dona Gracia's life is becoming very, very difficult. So she flees Portugal, and she goes together with her sister. Her sister's name was Brianda, and her nephews, who were Joao and Bernardo, Micas, obviously together with her baby Anna. They flee to where? To Antwerp. And that's where Beatrice's brother-in-law, as you may well remember, the one who was arrested for Judaizing and then released at the behest of the pressure of his brother Francisco. That brother Diogo is living there. By the way, Diogo actually eventually marries Brianda, the sister of Beatrice. In other words, his sister-in-law's sister. Okay. As we saw earlier, conversos were not allowed to return to Jewish practice in Antwerp, right? That's why Diogo was arrested. But during those years, the rulers of Antwerp were turning a blind eye to Judaizing conversos. It was illegal, but it was an open secret that they were okay with it. Now, Dona Gracia is not safe yet. Why is she not safe yet? She's not safe because her whole fortune is still tied up in Portugal. And so she stays in Antwerp until she can move her money into Antwerp. But even once she starts moving her money out, she is not safe. In 1544, Antwerp started cracking down on the increasing flow of Judaizing conversos, and the new King Charles V also starts to make advances for Beatrice's daughter Anna, also with his eye on the Mendez fortune. So the family picked up and fled again. This time they flee to Venice, Italy. Now, in Venice, they also continue to live as Christians officially. And I think it's important to say this because you would think that by the time, at the point that they're in Venice, and we all know, because I assume many of you have been to Venice, and you visited the Venice ghetto, and the Venice ghetto is operating already at that, the Venetian ghetto is already open at that point, and Jews are living openly as Jews in the Venetian ghetto. How and why that is a discussion for a different time, but it's important to understand the Jews were allowed to live there openly. So if that's the case, why were the Mendezes or Dona Gracia and her family not living openly as Jews? The answer is because their money was still tied up in Antwerp. They needed to maintain outward appearances as being Christians. But it is true, and we have a few sources to this, that in Venice itself, it was an open secret that the Mendez family practiced Judaism. Okay. Finally, in the year 1548, the Mendez family eventually manages to move all their money to Ferrara, and they moved to the city of Ferrara, which was a city-state that allowed conversos to openly return to Judaism. And here the family finally embraces Judaism once again openly, and they take on new Jewish names. Beatrice becomes Chana, or Gracia, the Spanish equivalent. Her daughter Anna becomes Reina. Reina is like a Ladino name. Think of it like, my wife's name is Gittel. It's like a Yiddish name, right? So it was considered like a Jewish Ladino name. Her nephew Joao becomes Yosef. The family adopts the family name Nasi, Hebrew for prince, which is a reflection of the family's prestigious past and their current financial success, etc. Now, what I want to talk about is Dona Gracia's journey, fleeing first from Spain to Portugal, then from Portugal to Antwerp, and from Antwerp to Venice, and from Venice to Ferrara. At every stage of the way, we have lots of documents proving that the Grazia fortune, or the Mendez fortune, was used over and over again to assist thousands of Jewish refugees, Spanish refugees who became Portuguese refugees to go to, as they went to Amsterdam or to Antwerp or to Italy, wherever they went. In fact, in his will, when Diogo dies, this is very interesting, very telling. It just goes to show how industrious and how much of a savvy businesswoman Dona Gracia was. Diogo does not leave his fortune to his wife, Beatrice, her sister. In fact, it becomes a point of contention, which is a story for a different time. But Dona Gracia becomes the official inheritor of the entire Mendez estate. All of the fortune of Diogo and Francisco, which was tremendous, apparently. I mean, evidenced even just by the fact that all the royals wanted to be in their good graces. He leaves the entire estate to her. So Doña Grazia, and this is where we're going to go back to Shmuel Ask to read about this, becomes sort of a mother, a nurturing mother, to all of these Jewish refugees. Some of them penniless, and some of them leaving fortunes behind. But she, in her state of success, does not forget about them and actually becomes sort of a mother caring for them, even in her industrious and wealthy, aristocratic way, if you will. She cares for all of them. Mark, would you like to read for us, please? We're holding text 8. You have to unmute yourself. Page 111, motherly care. Mark, we can't. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Text 8. Okay. Has God's mercy ever appeared to anyone in human garb? It has appeared to you to help you with your trouble. Has anyone ever seen a woman risk her life to save her brethren, as if she inherited Miriam's innate compassion, or govern her people with Deborah's remarkable prudence, or aid the persecuted with Esther's boundless virtue and surpassing piety, or free the besieged from anguish, like the chaste and generous widow Judith, a woman of true-hearted courage. The Lord has sent you such a woman in our own days from the supreme choir of his host. He has treasured all these virtues in a single soul. To your happy fortune, he chose to infuse them in the delicate and chaste person of the blessed Jewish Gracia Nasi. Her inspiration greatly encouraged your needy children in Portugal who are too poor and weak to leave the fire and to undertake a lengthy journey. She generously provided money and other needs and comforts to the refugees who arrived destitute, seasick, and stuporous in Flanders and elsewhere. She helped them overcome the rigors of the craggy Alps in Germany and other lands, and she hastened to alleviate the miseries caused by the hardships and hazards of their long journey. Thus, with her golden hand and angelic purpose, she lifted the majority of our people in Europe from the abyss of this hardship and countless others where poverty and sin had hurled them. She continued to guide them until they were in safe lands and until she had returned them to the obedience and precepts of their ancient God.
Thank you very much. In praise of Doña Grazia, Shmuel Usk invokes the names of ancient Jewish female heroes. Miriam, the sister of Moshe, who devotedly took care of the Jewish babies. Devorah, the wise prophetess who led the Jewish people during the era of the judges after they settled in the land of Israel. Queen Esther, of course, the heroine of Purim. Yehudit, who many of you may not be familiar with, but she's one of the heroines of the Hanukkah era. And they're invoking all of these people, saying that Doña Grazia embodied all of them in one person. She exhibited the complete devotion of her people, and the industriousness and resourcefulness to be able to take care of her affairs, and simultaneously a profound fear of heaven. With incredible bravery, he describes her as somebody, as like a motherly figure who gently carries her children from danger to safety. Shmuel Usk adds more. He says Doña Grazia didn't just take care of their physical needs. She didn't just shelter them physically. She also helped them spiritually. Indeed, one of the books that we have today, and on page 112 you can see what I'm talking about here. One of the books that we have today is called the Ferrara Bible. Ferrara because it was published in Ferrara, Italy, at the time, in the 1500s, when, it looks like in 1553, when the Jews are arriving to Italy, and finally many of these Jews are fully embracing their Judaism once again. And one of the needs that they have is that they don't read or speak Hebrew. This has always been a problem, right? Whenever Jews go through another round of tribulations, they need the new language. And at the time, the common language among the Jews at the time is Ladino. And she actually completely foots the bill. And you can see on page 112 that in the I mean, you can imagine printing any book at that time would have been very, very expensive in the 1500s, right? And in the preface of the work, it thanks its generous sponsor, the most magnificent lady, Doña Grazia Nasi, la muy magnifica Signora Doña Grazia Nasi. You see this? Anyways, after a few years of Ferrara, Italy, in 1553, the family moves to Constantinople, which is today Istanbul, in other words, in the Ottoman Empire. And Grazia's nephew marries Grazia's daughter Anna. Remember the famous or the infamous daughter. And he actually takes over a lot of the estate. And for the next piece of history about Doña Grazia, we're going to turn to, again, I told you there's so many sources that point to her story and the unbelievable woman that she was, which is one of the reasons why she made it into this course. There was a German merchant whose name was Hans Drunstwam. He did business in Constantinople during that period, and he describes the family in his diary. Now, it's important to understand that this Drunstwam is by no means a fan of the Jewish people. In fact, as he's describing the generosity and the kindness and the compassion of Doña Grazia and how much she gives away her money in order to help the Jewish people, he describes her as weird. He's like, there must be something wrong with her that she's giving away money. Elise, if you can read for us, please, text 9, on page 113.
Hey. In 1553, an old Portuguese woman, Gracia Medicia Nasi, came to Constantinople from Venice with her daughter and servants. The Jews are very proud of her, call her a signora. She lives in a luxury and extravagance, has many servants, maids, also among them 2 from the Netherlands. She has said to have been formerly a Marano and here to have become a Jewess again. The Senora, who I have mentioned, and her son-in-law live in such a state that would amply befit a prince. They feed about 80 people a day, must have cheated people somewhere. Something must be wrong with them. They allege that they have left a lot of wealth behind them, and also that some is following them on the sea. On considering the cost of living in Turkey, their wealth will soon shrink here. Sounds familiar. They gave the pashas a lot and distributed several thousand ducats to the poor Jews or their hospital.
Grazia and her son-in-law Yosef sponsored, right? So she's now known as Chana or Doña Grazia, right? Her son-in-law is known as Don Yosef. Don and Doña are the honorific titles that you give to a man and a woman, respectively. So Grazia and her son-in-law Yosef sponsored yeshivas. They sponsored synagogues for all of this for the Portuguese ex-conversos, but across the Mediterranean. All right, we see this today, even in the names of some of the shuls that we have that preserved till today. For example, there is a shul that is called, I think it's called Even Chain, Livyas Chain. And we have today the sermon that was delivered by Rabbi Moshe Almosiano at the opening of the Livyas Chain shul. Right? Why is it called Livyas Chain? The accompaniment of charisma. Chain, because of her Hebrew name, Chana. In other words, she was the generous benefactor of the shul, and Chain is for her name. There's also other records that we have of different openings of shuls and yeshivas, etc. She is literally leading the way when it comes to the revival of Judaism amongst these conversos as they're traveling from galus to galus, from exile to exile. And in 1561, Doña Grazia embarks on the most revolutionary and ambitious project on behalf of her Jewish brethren. I want to just clarify something. To date, from temple times until modern Zionism, I am not familiar with any other attempt, any other movement that really took off to one degree or another, even though obviously it was unsuccessful, to resettle Jews in the land of Israel. And Doña Grazia does this. In 1561, she starts to purchase land in Tiberias, in Tiberia, and she has these really high hopes. She doesn't believe that this is the coming of Mashiach, but she believes that if we can get many, many Jews to move to Israel, sound familiar? Then maybe Mashiach will come as a result of that, and the Jews will already be there. And in fact, hundreds and hundreds of Jews. To be sure, Jews have lived in Israel since temple times, but not many of them. And the bill wasn't being footed by somebody Jewish. And here she starts this project. Let's read about it from the mouth of a Portuguese Christian pilgrim. Mark, if you can read it for us, please. It's going to be text 10. He visited Israel in approximately 1565, and he's describing this new Jewish settlement in Tiberias. Go for it. Mark, if you can, please. Page 114, text 10. High hopes.
At the time we left Jerusalem, I heard from Portuguese Jews about a Portuguese Jewish woman who had escaped that kingdom with a great deal of property, and who had thus become very powerful and had a great name in those countries. She bought this city of Tiberias from the Sultan for the price of a large sum of money and payment of a perpetual tax of 1,000 cruzados per year, and that next summer she and all her family will leave Istanbul to live there, and together with her, all the Jews who will be following her. Upon hearing this news, all of the Jews who live in the land of Israel are full of great happiness, for they hope that if these people come and settle here, the Messiah will come.
Okay. This project starts in 1565, but actually, sadly, Dona Grazia never made it to Israel. She passed away in 1569. And she was mourned across the Jewish world. She was eulogized as the matriarch of the Portuguese ex-converso diaspora, in other words, the resurgence of Judaism. And she's depicted as the paragon of the Jewish ideal, Eshet Chayil Miyimtza, a woman of valor who can find. In fact, the great rabbi of Safed, of Tzfat, Rabbi Moshe Ditrani, beautifully expressed his praise, actually substituting one of the words in Eshet Chayil for her name. At least if you can read it for us, please. Text 11, Chana the greatest.
Hey. Many women have performed worthily, but Hannah surpassed them all.
This is literally a quote from Eshet Chayil that he's just substituting, right? Instead of, but the woman surpasses them all, which I think is the original, and you have surpassed them all, which is the poetic language of the poem. He replaces it with Hannah. Dona Grazia's legacy actually continued after her lifetime. Her son-in-law and business partner Don Yosef Nasi, who we mentioned already, after Don Yosef died in 1579, Grazia's only daughter Reina continued the family tradition of supporting yeshivas and funding the printing of Jewish books. And we don't have a portrait of Dona Grazia, but we do have a portrait of her daughter in the form of this medal on page 115 that is produced in Ferrara in 1557. In her remarkable life, Dona Grazia exemplified all of the traits, I would argue, of the Jewish woman of valor. Her incredible success as one of the wealthiest people in the world was a testament to her industriousness and her resourcefulness. Many of us are familiar with the fact that sometimes the main person in the family who earned, the most industrious person in the family who earned all the money dies, and then the inheritors waste it all or don't take it on to the next step. Dona Grazia was clearly not like that. She was industrious. She was resourceful. She was all the things that we mentioned in our first exercise from the poem of Eshet Chayil. Her devotion and generosity to her people is legendary. If you take a look at some of the statements we make in Eshet Chayil about what the devotion of a woman is supposed to look like, what the nurturing attitude of a woman is supposed to look like, not just for her family, but for her community and for all those around her, that is exemplified by Dona Grazia. And finally, her fear of God is attested to by her sponsorship of Jewish books and synagogues and yeshivas, and her insistence that Judaism should come back despite whatever it had been through in that era. We will conclude with text 12. Elise, if you can read it for us, please. Text 12 is from page 116. On page 116 is from the Rebbe. It's from an address. I'm sorry, it's from a letter of the Rebbe, where the Rebbe is describing the ideal of a Jewish woman. And if the Rebbe doesn't say he's talking about Dona Grazia, but if you can't hear this and translate this as literally Dona Grazia's life in a nutshell, it's so clear. Go ahead, Elise. Text 12, page 116.
The inner spark of Jewish consciousness, the Pintele Yid, is present and complete in all Jews, regardless of their external conditions or circumstances. However, we must work to awaken this inner core within ourselves and others so that it should become revealed, influencing and guiding all the particulars of daily life. Jewish women play a particularly important role in this task because divine Providence has endowed Jewish women with special qualities and abilities to achieve this. Women are endowed with greater and more expressive qualities of sensitivity and warmth. They are therefore best suited to awaken and evoke the innate inner feelings that every Jew possesses: love for God, love for Torah, and love for fellow Jews.
Beautiful. With this, we will conclude our conversation about Doña Gracia. The second unsung heroine that we are going to introduce today is the story of Rebbetzin Bela Katz. Well, because while Doña Gracia was a remarkable philanthropist and she supported a lot of Jewish scholarship, I don't know that we have any record that she was a scholar in and of herself. But our next personality was a scholar in her own right. We're also shifting cultures now, by the way, as you could probably tell by the prefix Rebbetzin. I don't know that any woman in the golden era of Spain, or even afterwards during the era of the Conversos, I don't know that any woman was called Rebbetzin. Maybe Rabbanit, but that's not the way they called. Donya was the name, right? But here we are clearly in the Ashkenazi lands of Poland and Ukraine. Bela Katz was born in 1573 in Lvov, Galicia, which today would be in Ukraine, where her father, Rabbi Yisrael Edels, was a very wealthy community leader. At age 16, she married Rabbi Yehoshua Falk Katz, who was already Falk is like a Polish, not Polish, I think a Slavic Jewish name. It means wolf, like Wolf is the German version of it, right? Or wolf is the English version of it. So I think in the Slavic language is Falk is wolf. In any event, she is born. So at age 16, she marries Rabbi Yeshua Falk Katz, and who at the time is already one of the leading scholars of the time, and he's going to go on to write one of the most a commentary that I learned when I had to go for my rabbinic ordination. The Drisha Uprisha and the Smeh are two of his books, which are commentary on the Jewish Code of Law written by Rabbi Yosef Cairo, known as the Mechaber of the Shulchan Aruch. And his commentary are staples. They're like requirements if you want to be able to understand properly the Jewish Code of Law. Now, most of our knowledge of Bela, in other words, Rebbetzin Bela Katz, comes to us from the introduction to her husband's Derisha Uprisha. Now, he did not publish it during his lifetime. Their son, Rabbi Yosef Yuspa Katz, publishes his father's work, and in a very, very unique move, in the introduction, which normally would just talk about his father's life, he actually talks quite a bit about his mother. Mark, if you can read for us the opening one, page 119, where you see just how much stock he places in his mother. Text 13 on page 119, role model.
I cannot refrain from committing to writing the account of the many wonderful qualities of the distinguished, modest, devout, and righteous woman, my mother, my teacher, Rebbetzin Baila, the daughter of the community leader and philanthropist Rabbi Israel Idels of blessed memory. Her radiant splendor and glory were not ours alone, but belonged to all the people of her generation. She was as beautiful as the moon, pure, and a glory to all the daughters of Israel. The women saw her and acclaimed her pleasant deeds, and she guided them on the proper path. She is therefore deserving of the honor to have some of her good deeds recorded in writing. This will preserve her memory for future generations, so that all Jewish women may learn from her and emulate her.
Thank you very much. Rabbi Yosef writes that by the way, you can tell that he's playing with the words of Eshet Chayil. Anybody notice that? It's the same words from the Woman of Valor that he's kind of playing with to eulogize his mother as he's describing her greatness. He goes on to highlight his mother's disregard for worldly pleasures. Believe it or not, a young girl who presumably wants to be beautiful like all the other girls at the time, and yet that's not her and she could have been, because she was born into a wealthy family, and yet that's not where her mind is. Clearly she grew up in a home where she was educated as somebody to focus more on the spiritual than on the physical. He describes her as somebody who didn't care for money and comfort. She rejected physical pleasures, and she fasted often. He writes that she would cook up sumptuous feasts, but she barely tasted of them herself. She would serve them all to her family and to the poor. And Rabbi Yosef describes his mother's daily schedule. It's unbelievable. Elise, if you can read it for us, please, text 14, about how much she prays, how much she studies Torah, etc.
Okay. All of her days, both in winter and summer, she always rose early, several hours before dawn, and prayed at length with great devotion. She held the key to the women's section of the synagogue and was the first to arrive and the last to leave. She'd remain in the synagogue 1 or 2 hours after everyone else had left, completing her prayers and supplications. After her prayers, she did not indulge in any idle matters. She went on to study Torah, reading the weekly Torah portion with Rashi's commentary, as well as other commentaries. This is all well known to all of my father's students who ate at our table. Whenever they discussed Torah matters at the meal, she would join the discussion, like one of the students. She would occasionally come up with original interpretations that were as sweet as honey. She was especially knowledgeable in the laws pertaining to women. She always devoted her mind and heart to understanding the reason behind the Torah's laws.
Thank you. Rabbi Tzimbeila Katz was always the first to arrive at the synagogue and the last to leave, but she wasn't just a pious woman of prayer. She was also a woman of learning. She was highly learned, and I want to remind you guys of the era that we're talking about. Okay, we need to remember that this is a time that I would call survival of the fittest. Physical strength was the key element for human survival, not intellectualism. Most people in the world at the time, both men and women, were illiterate. Now it's true, by the way, from a young age, men were working physical jobs, women generally stayed home and provided for the families. Education was restricted to the elites of society, the wealthy who could afford it, and the religious scholars. It is true that in the Jewish world, things were very different. All young Jewish boys were taught to read and write, and were even given a basic Jewish education until around the age of bar mitzvah. That's why they call us the people of the book. We've always put an emphasis on that. And accomplished scholars would continue their studies later on, while others, obviously, after bar mitzvah, would begin working. But for girls, there was no organized educational system. Now, Jewish girls were given an education informally at home, as much as they were able to. In other words, as much as the parents were able to, depending on their status. Literacy was standard among Jewish women. And there was a library of some Yiddish books on the Chumash and the matters of Jewish ethics, especially the ones that are more relevant to women. But most families could not afford to provide a more advanced education for their daughters as well. Now, Bela was born into a wealthy family, and her father clearly put an emphasis on providing her with a good Jewish education. And that's why Bela, this accomplished scholar, would often get involved in the conversations. And on at least 2 occasions, in her father's work, you actually see her quoted as an authority on the law. Whether we follow that law or not is a different discussion. That's just the nature of halacha. But she's definitely up there giving opinions. Let's take a look at one of them, shall we? We're going to talk about the blessings over mitzvot. Okay. Text 15 needs a little bit of background, but I actually think we'll just start it by reading it. Mark, if I can ask you just to read it, and then I'll explain it afterwards. Okay? Go for it.
The blessing over Shabbat candles lighting is recited after lighting the candles. However, to fulfill the requirement that a blessing should precede the mitzvah act, we should not benefit from the light before reciting the blessing. Therefore, after lighting the candles, we block the candle's light with our hand and recite the blessing, after which we remove our hand. As a result, the blessing is considered to have been recited before the mitzvah action.
Okay. Elise, I imagine you've been lighting, and Helene, I imagine you guys have been lighting Shabbat candles for many, many years. I don't know if you're familiar with this technicality of the law. You know how to do it because your mother's taught you, but I'm curious if you guys are familiar with this technicality of the law. Why is it that the way the Jewish women light candles, as everybody knows, is they light the candles, then there's a spiritual significance to the 3 times, okay, and then they wave 3 times, and then they cover their eyes. That's when they make the blessing, that's when they pray, and then they open their eyes. What's going on here? It's essentially a solution to a very technical problem. What is the technical problem? Brachos are always supposed to be made. Blessings are always supposed to be made. This is a rule across Jewish law. Blessings are always supposed to be made before the act. A blessing on a mitzvah should always be made before the act of the mitzvah. So, men on the Zoom, Think of tefillin. You make a blessing on tefillin, right? You put it on your arm, you get all ready, then you make the blessing on tefillin, then you do the tefillin. Women on the Zoom, think of challah, right? You make the whole dough, you prepare the whole thing, you make a blessing, and then you pinch off a piece of dough, right? The blessing always precedes the act. It's like that with lulav and etrog. It's like that with anything. Now, the problem is when you come to Shabbat candles, you have a problem. Why? Because if you make a blessing on Shabbat candles, and according to some opinions, Shabbat has already come in. And now if you're going to go and you're going to light the candles, you're actually going to be violating Shabbat. Why? Because you're going to be lighting a fire on Shabbat. So what's our solution? Our solution is as follows. The mitzvah is not really to light the candles. The mitzvah is to benefit from the light of the candles on Shabbat, right? If you really want to split hairs. So what do? We light the candle. We don't make a blessing yet. We cover our eyes so that we cannot see, so that the ladies cannot see, so that the woman who's lighting the candles cannot see and the benefit from the light. Now she makes the blessing. Like this, when she opens her eyes, the blessing is preceding the act. Okay? That's the solution. All right. Okay, so hold on a second. Now, until now, everything we've been talking about has been Shabbat. But we also light candles on a Jewish holiday, right? And the common practice is to follow the same order on these days. Light the candles, which is the act, then make the blessing with the eyes covered, and then uncover the eyes and benefit from the light. Does anybody see the inconsistency here? Rebbetzin and Bela Katz did. On Yom Tov, you're actually allowed to light candles from a pre-existing flame, right, as we know. With the reason for flipping the bracha mitzvah order gone, Rebbetzin and Bela Katz argues that the blessing for Yom Tov candles should actually be made before we light the candles. And there's no need to cover the eyes. Elise, since you're reading, since you're our token Jewish woman here, at least one that can read, because Helene is on, but she's on the phone, and I don't think she can read. So text 16 on page 123. Can you read for us how Rabbi Yosef Yuspa quotes his mother with her suggestion? Go ahead.
Okay, consider this common error that my mother identified regarding the candle lighting practice for the festivals. Common practice is to observe the identical order of festivals as it is done for Shabbat, meaning that women first light the candles, shield the light with their hands, recite the blessing, and then remove their hands. This is indeed proper for lighting Shabbat candles because lighting after the blessing is problematic. On festivals, however, it is permitted to light the candles during the actual festival. It is therefore better to follow the regular blessing mitzvah sequence and to recite the blessing before lighting the festive candles.
Anyways, in this text, Rebbetzin Bela's son, a recognized scholar in his own right, records his mother's instructions and endorses them. Now, I don't want to bore you guys with the conversation that comes after this, which is that there's opinions that hold that his mother is correct, there are opinions that hold that his mother is incorrect, and then eventually the halacha is that she is correct, but we're not going to follow her. Why? Essentially, basically, the conclusion is that we don't want to confuse people. If you start to have people doing that on the holiday, then they're not going to do it on Shabbat that way, right? They may end up confusing the holiday and Shabbat, and that's why it doesn't. But ultimately, all the halakha authorities agree that she is theoretically correct. In other words, she's part of this scholarly conversation. And the reason I say this is not to show that women can also learn. That's clear that women can also learn, and women can also study Torah, and women should also study Torah as much as they're able to. What I'm trying to show you is that this is a woman who was not just wealthy, was not just pious, was not just studying Torah, but she cared. She was God-fearing about every single aspect of Jewish law that things should be done in a perfect way. And for all of her devotion to prayer and study, she still managed to be balancing it, just like the ideal prototypical woman of valor. She managed to balance it with, you guessed it. Let's go back here. Hold on. She managed to balance it with in industriousness or industry and resourcefulness. In terms of her compassion and her kindness to other people, all of these values that we identified as the prototypical ones for a Jewish woman. Mark, you're back. Text 17, family and community.
Okay, 17. After her regimen of prayer and Torah study, she would engage in acts of kindness. She would visit the sick, comfort mourners. There was no mitzvah in the city in which she did not involve herself. If there was still time left to the day, she would not be idle. She would spin threads of Tzitzit
Tzitzis.
prepare the material for sewing Torah scroll, parchments, and sew talit and kittel robes. She supervised her household, guiding her children and grandchildren. She also cared for the young students, preparing food for them, repairing their clothes, and arranging for them to be able to bathe before Shabbat. She had no trace of haughtiness and was exceedingly generous with charity, even beyond her means. All of her thoughts and deeds were focused on finalizing mitzvah actions to perform, finding mitzvah.
Thank you, Mark. As you read through these texts of her son describing her life, you can literally hear the verses of the Woman of Valor poem leaping off of the page and turning into a real life woman. She literally, if she has extra time, what does she do? She sews. And what does she sew? Only mitzvot. Literally. Tzitzit and kittles and talitot, etc. On page 125, the picture of a woman praying is at the grave of her husband, Rabbi Yeshua Falk Katz. That's in Lvov, in the city where she, right, in modern day Ukraine. This picture is from circa 1920s. The grave was destroyed together with the entire ancient Jewish cemetery of Lvov by the Nazis and the Soviets. After her children grew up, she decided to make Aliyah to Israel. I believe her husband, she was widowed at the age of 41 in 1614. Her husband had already died. So she finished raising her children. In 1623, she decided to make Aliyah, to move to Israel, to devote her life to study, prayer, and charity. There too, she became very, very well known for her piety and for her scholarship. And after she died in 1631, she was given the honor of burial on Har HaZeitim, or the Mount of Olives, right next to the grave of Zechariah Hanavi. By the way, for those that are familiar, we treat the graves of the righteous very, very carefully. Like those that are in proximity to the righteous should also be righteous and should also be part of that. It should be appropriate for them to be buried there. And the fact that the locals in Israel at the time in Jerusalem at the time, in the 1640s, would have allowed her to be buried, or 1630s, would have allowed her to be buried not just on Har HaZeitim, but right next to Zechariah Hanavi, Zechariah the prophet, is a testament to her piousness in and of itself. You can see a picture of her gravesite on page 125. I think what I love about today's lesson is that the two characters we learned about are very different. Donya Grazia and the Rebbetzin Bela Katz lived in very different times. Their lives on a day-to-day basis looked different. But the character traits that they represented were the same. These character traits of being industrious, being resourceful, not being lazy, being caring, being devoted to their people, being nurturing to their family, to their communities, and to the Jewish people as a whole, are things that you can see clearly paralleled in the two of them. So, for Jewish women today, what I would hope that my daughters would grow up to be, we're not looking for them to be wealthy spice merchants, that somehow are industrious in that way and help Portuguese escapees and their conversos that are now returning to Judaism. That's the technical life of Donya Grazia. But the soul of her life is the same as the soul of the life of Rebbetzin Bela Katz, and the same as the soul of the life of thousands upon thousands, upon hundreds and hundreds of thousands, upon millions and millions of Jewish women who lived throughout history, which is to embody the words of Eshet Chayil Miyimtza, a woman of valor who can find, and to find ways in 21st century America to embody those values and to live those lives. If any of you have any time, I would encourage you to look up the life story of Glikkel Hamon, which follows the same pattern, which is our third Jewish woman of valor, which is portrayed in the lesson appendix. And with this, we will conclude our lesson for today with a video. Please turn your attention to the video screens for a summary of today's lesson. Here we go.
Lesson 3. Unsung Heroines. Narratives. 1. Doña Gracia was born in Portugal in the early 16th century to a family that had been forced to convert to Christianity, but had continued practicing Judaism clandestinely. After fleeing Portugal and openly embracing Judaism, Dona Gracia used her enormous fortune to help her fellow Portuguese Jews escape. She helped the refugees re-establish themselves financially and bankrolled institutions and publications to fully restore their Jewish faith and practice. 2. Rebbetzin Bela Katz lived in Lviv in the 16th and 17th centuries. Her husband, Rabbi Yehoshua Falk Katz, was a leading Halachic authority. Rebbetzin Bela maintained a busy daily schedule of prayer, Torah study, family and household maintenance, and communal activism. A scholar in her own right, she proposed halachic opinions that are highly regarded by halachic authorities. General points. 1. Historically, Jewish women have been considered the mainstays of their homes and communities, and they played unique roles in nurturing the Jewish family, community, and faith. 2. The classic Woman of Valor song from Proverbs ascribes 5 prominent characteristics to the ideal Jewish woman: industriousness, resourcefulness, devotion, generosity, and awe of God.
Thank you all for joining us for Lesson 3. This has been Unsung Heroines, and we look forward to welcoming you all next week for our 4th and final lesson, Heroes and Hostages, where we will examine 3 episodes from throughout Jewish history where famous Jews were held hostage or dealt with a hostage crisis and how they dealt with it. And hopefully that those lessons will not be needed because all the hostages will already be home before then. Thank you all for joining us.